Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and thank you if you're viewing this online. My name is Michael Clerizo, and for a living I write about watches. And my connection to the story we're going to hear about today actually started around 4 years ago, on January 17th, 2018. Now, this was a rather boring day for me. I was sitting on a beach in Thailand, working on my tan, reading some potboiler escapist novel I've probably already forgotten about. I know that sounds like paradise to some people, but I was rather bored. And so I went to check on my emails. And when I did, there was an email from this gentleman, Scott Lenga, that changed the day completely. Because Scott explained in the email that his father, Harry Lenga, and his two brothers had survived 6 years in Nazi slave labor camps and concentration camps, partly because they were watchmakers. Now, I was already researching this topic of watchmaking in the Nazi camps, and Scott's email and request for more information about the watch world, and might I possibly be willing to give the memoirs a read, totally fascinated me, changed the day. So, Scott, hello, and
Hi.
Welcome to Watches and Wonders in Geneva.
Thank you, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Michael, for all of your support these last several years, and to the FHH for inviting me to participate in this wonderful conference.
Now, Scott, your father is born in Poland early on in the 20th century, 1919?
1919, yes.
Okay. His father is a watchmaker. Your father acquires the craft from your father. And then eventually your father and his two brothers spend 6 years in slave labor and concentration camps. Your father then emigrates to St. Louis, Missouri, the show me state. And you're born there. You go to school in California, you become a lawyer, living in San Francisco. And at some point in the 1990s, you start to record your father's memories about life in Poland and in the camps. And here it is, 2022, and the book is coming out. I'm just curious, what took you so long?
Well, with your permission, I'll take maybe a little bit long to answer the question because it's kind of an open question. So, I was inspired to interview my father because he did some very extensive interviews with somebody else at the Holocaust Center in St. Louis, Missouri, in the 1980s. And this was a response all across North America to record the testimony of survivors to respond to the Holocaust denial movement that was emerging in the 1970s. And I read those transcripts, and I was quite taken with them, because here were written down all the stories that I had seen, that I had heard from my father directly when I was a kid. But I found that as I was reading them, I was saying to myself, why didn't the interviewer ask this question, or why did she ask that question? And I really wanted to get in the game. So that was so it took me a couple of years to get to the point where I would start interviewing my father. Once was on a visit to my family home in St. Louis, and then in the early 90s, something clicked inside my head, and I realized my father wasn't going to be around forever. And I invited him to join me in San Francisco for a week, where I was living at the time. And we spent a solid week just doing interviews. Now, as you mentioned, that was in the early 90s. And those interviews, the tapes from those interviews, sat in a cabinet for some 20 years. I guess there's a to answer why. This project has been chasing me for my entire adult life. And in my mid-50s, I got so fat and slow that it finally caught me. And for me personally, it was okay that these interview tapes were sitting in a cabinet for all these years because I knew the stories. And I honestly thought that that would be enough to preserve my father's legacy. When I had my own children some years later, and my father passed away in 2000. So when I had my own children and they were growing up, these were the bedtime stories that I told them. Hi. Because I wanted them to internalize the character traits of my father, his resilience and initiative and his brotherhood, sense of brotherhood. And I wanted them to kind of internalize that as a family legacy before they got old enough to start learning about the larger story of the Holocaust in school. And it wasn't until they got a bit older when I wanted them to hear these stories directly from my father, the way that I had heard them, that I suddenly understood that the volume of material on these interview tapes was just too much for them to sit down and watch them all the way through. So I could see that these stories would become diluted from generation to generation, and I understood that I couldn't let that happen and I needed to do something. Add to that my daughter Orly, when she was about 10 years old, started threatening to write this book herself if I didn't do it. And then my older brother Michael died. And I caught a cold glimpse of my own mortality. And I understood that it was now or never.
Okay. Well, I'm glad the tapes finally caught you. I hope you haven't slowed down too much since then, and I'm sure anyone who reads this book will appreciate the fact that you slowed down enough to create the book. But I know, Scott, that your view of the experience of your father and his brothers, which you recount in the book, you view it very much as a journey. And I'd like you to talk about exactly what is the journey that you see for your father.
So my father had a very tough childhood. His mother died in childbirth when he was just 4 years old. Excuse me. And his family fell into a cycle of poverty that they could never get out of.
And this was in the village in Poland? This
was in the village in Poland. There's a village called Koźniec, which is a small village of about 10,000 people, and just over half of them were Jews. My father had, and his brothers had a tough relationship with their father. He was impatient, and he was really hard on his kids. Wanted to make sure that they got an education, wanted to make sure they did the right thing. He was a single parent, and as we all know, that's really a tough thing to do, especially when you're in an impoverished situation. And my grandfather Michael, who I never met, was committed to the Hasidic way of struggling with the hardship in his own life. There were many days when his family had literally nothing to eat for that day and not even enough money to buy a loaf of bread. And he would stare hunger and poverty in the face and give his last coins to somebody who came into his store begging for charity. My grandfather Michael thought that he was teaching his kids how to walk the true spiritual path, but it was too much for them. And my father used to run out and cry silently when this would happen. But things were very different at my grandfather's watchmaking bench. He didn't try to push his sons or force them to become watchmakers and learn that trade. But when they came with their own initiative, he was very encouraging and patient and taught them by example the focus and the patience required for that precision work. And they had no idea at the time how valuable those watchmaking skills would be for them later in the war. And it was only later in the war that my father understood, when he was faced with the brutality of the oppression under the Nazis, that this religious discipline that he resented as he was a kid was really a kind of survival training that gave him and his brothers an ability to keep their emotional balance in the face of brutal oppression and to do acts of kindness for other people in the most extreme circumstances. So a couple of years later in the war, on September 26, 1942, this was the night before the Germans rounded up all of the Jews in my father's town and sent them to their deaths in Treblinka. My grandfather Michael got a tip from a local captain of the Polish police telling him that this was going to happen. And he sent his 3 sons away to escape that very night. And in a heart-wrenching scene of tears and prayer, he packed all of his watchmaking tools into a suitcase, gave them to his sons, and told them where he was going, he wouldn't need them. And with those tools, he bought their lives many times over in the slave labor camps of Wolanów and Starchowice. And those tools were literally tools of survival for them. But not only that, those tools were a kind of amulet, you could say. They were a vital emotional connection to their father, a physical connection, representation of his prayers and tears when he sent them off. And that gave them real strength to withstand the situations that they found themselves in. And when those precious tools were taken away from them on the ramp in Auschwitz, along with all of their clothes and all of their body hair, and even their names when numbers were tattooed into their arms, this was my father's response. We knew that our hair would grow back and that the numbers were tattooed on our arms, not in our minds. But losing our watchmaking tools left us completely naked. Right away, I made a screwdriver by grinding the end of a nail. Then I made a tweezer from the spring of an old pair of earmuffs. I also found a little toothbrush I could use to clean watch parts. There were so many plundered watches in Auschwitz. The Germans would trade those watches with each other inside the camp. The Block Altister, the foreman in our barrack, was a Polish guy. He got a hold of broken watches somehow, and we fixed them in his office after work. With those few tools, I could take apart a watch to clean it and put it back together. Of course, I couldn't fix a watch that needed a new part. When that happened, I told him the watch could not be fixed and asked if he would let me have it for the parts. He agreed, and soon we had watches for ourselves in Auschwitz. My father and his brothers were able to accumulate 4 working watches in Auschwitz. And 4 times they traded a watch to stay together. In the end, all of them survived, and they were liberated from a concentration camp called Ebensee in Austria by the U.S. Army. There were actually only 2 tanks that liberated the concentration camp, and they rolled into the concentration camp to liberate it, and the tank commanders got out of the tanks and gave a little speech, and my father never knew the names of these GIs, but he said many times to me that he would never forget their faces. So in the process of writing this book, I was able to find the names of these GIs. One was named Bob Persinger. The other was named Dick Pamonti. And scrolling on the photos here is a photo of the actual tank, the Lady Luck, that liberated the Ebensee concentration camp, and a photo of the 2 GIs that liberated my father. So that's where.
Are we moving
toward? You're moving toward that. There it is. So you see the Lady Luck. It was, I was able to strike up a relationship with the children of Bob Persinger, and they gave me these wonderful photographs.
Okay. Could you go back to that slide just for a moment, please? And up the upper right-hand corner, as I'm facing.
The one on the right is Bob Persinger. The one closer to the center is Dick Pamonti.
Ah, okay. And that's the tank that rolled in?
That's the actual tank.
Wow. Okay, so let's continue on the journey.
Okay, well that was mostly that was what I wanted to convey. I could keep going if you have additional questions, but just let me know if there's something you're curious about.
You said your father and his brothers were able to trade the watches so they could stay together. What actually happened? What are the details of that exchange? How do you trade a watch for staying together in Auschwitz?
In Auschwitz specifically, and there's some amazing stories for this. And I'll try to condense. So let me know if I'm going on too long. One of the problems that they had when they accumulated these watches was how to hide them so they wouldn't get stolen, because watches were of great value in Auschwitz and not something that prisoners would normally have. So my father's brother, Moshe, came up with this idea to hide them inside bars of soap. So he would work bars of soap so they would soften up, put a watch inside of it, and reform it in the shape of a bar of soap, and they would carry a bar of soap around them with them. The most dramatic story, I think, of trading a watch was that my father was put on a list of people to be sent to work in what was called the Sonderkommando, which it's kind of macabre thing to talk about, but this was the group of people whose responsibility it was to burn bodies after they had been put in the gas chamber, and it was very terrible work, and everybody knew that whoever got that job didn't last too long. And my father found out that he was being sent to this detail from this Polish guy who was the Block Altister that he was fixing watches from. And he was able to find out who was the person who had authority over this list of workers. And he, to make a very long story short, he managed to sneak into this guy's office, confront him, and tell him that he was a French guy, also a prisoner, by the way, but had a better administrative job in the camp. And he went to him and started crying, telling him that he knew he was on this list and that he could never do that job, and he would never be in a situation where he could kill somebody. And his tears somehow, along with the offer to give this guy a watch in exchange for getting him off this list, somehow opened this guy's heart and maybe his self-interest as well, and he took him off the list.
Okay. And you mentioned another thing that's quite interesting. On the night your father and his brothers leave their town, your grandfather had been tipped off by a Polish policeman. Why do you think that happened? Why did the Polish policeman tip off your grandfather? Do you have any ideas about that?
Yes. So my grandfather was one of two watchmakers in the town, and he knew everybody because he was a watchmaker. And this Polish policeman was somebody that he was friends with, and he knew him over the years. So even though, and this is one of the very interesting things about these stories, is that even though this Polish policeman was at the very center of implementing the final solution of evacuating all of the Jewish population from this town and putting them on a train, and working, very closely with the occupation authorities, it wasn't a separate force. They were completely controlled by the German occupation authorities. But yet the personal relationship, and he actually had a watch that my grandfather had fixed for him, and the night that he came to tip him off, he was also coming to pick up his watch.
So your grandfather had relationships with people throughout the village?
My grandfather had relationships throughout the village, and I think that ability of my grandfather to cultivate those personal relationships and call in these favors that really saved their lives was something my father learned and carried into the slave labor camps and concentration camps. And he was able to look for an opportunity to find an opening, a sort of glimmer of humanity in the eyes of somebody who is otherwise a murderer, to be able to do that person a kind of a favor that would open up some kind of relationship. And he did it over and over again. It's really quite an extraordinary aspect of the story, I think.
And there was one German guard in particular that your father approached with an offer to fix a watch, not knowing the man had a watch that needed to be fixed. And that's quite an important part in the book, because it's when your father moves from, shall we say, ordinary slave labor work into being a watchmaker in the camp. And the policeman, the guard's name was?
Corbinus.
And what basically happened that day? Because it took a lot of nerve on your father's part to approach this guard the way he did. Tell us about that.
Okay. So with your permission, it's not such a short story.
Okay.
But as you say, it's a pivotal story, and I think a story that would be of interest to people in the watch world. So my father was found himself in this slave labor camp. It was called Volanov. And he was doing very hard labor, working construction. I think his job at the time was unloading sacks of cement from train cars as they would come in to support this construction project. And the architect or the engineer or the foreman, it was somebody who was doing all of these roles, was a Nazi civilian, actually. He wasn't military, but he was brought in, given an SS title, and given the job of being the overseer of this work project that was going on. And he was a very brutal character, and he would come out and beat people literally to death for apparently no reason. Nobody was working well enough, nobody was working fast enough. And my father understood that if he continued working like that, he would be worn out and he would get injured and they would simply kill him. So something went off in my father's head one day and decided that he would try and approach him. He was kind of a well-dressed guy. He seemed to have so my father went up to him and said, "I would like to do you a favor." And the guy looks at him and says, "You're going to do me a favor?" And my father said, No, I misspoke. I'm a watchmaker, and I would like to have the honor of fixing a watch for you. And so they went through this little dialogue, if you're a watchmaker, where are your tools? And my father convinced them that maybe he's a watchmaker. And my father thought he was already sorry that he opened up the conversation, thinking that he was only digging himself deeper into trouble with this guy. But this guy ended the conversation saying, "Tomorrow I'll bring a watch and we'll see if you can fix it." So the next morning, sure enough, he brought a watch. And my father met him the next morning. He shuttled him to a little room in the back of his office and showed him the watch. It was a pocket watch, I believe. Asked him for a little knife to open up the back of the watch. And he opened up the watch, and the watch was completely empty inside. There was no movement. It was just a dial and a plate. And the guy, my father said, he felt the intensity of the guy's gaze on the back of his neck as he was asking him, "So, can you fix it?" And my father just said yes, without thinking about it. And at the time, he had no idea how he was going to fix that watch. But he kind of understood that he had to play this confidence game. And the guy said, you mean it? You can fix this watch? My father said, yes, I can fix this watch. It will take a long time. It'll take me maybe 3-4 months, but I can fix this watch. And the guy told him, okay, I'm going to let you sit in this office. You're not going to go out to work outside anymore. You'll sit here and fix this watch. But take as much time as you want. But he said that, and my father said, this is what he did with his finger. He said, but that watch has to be fixed. And from then on, my father was sitting in this room working on this watch. Now, your next question is going to be, how did he fix this watch?
Yes, that's very perceptive, Scott.
So you remember that his father gave him these tools. I forgot to mention, with the tools, he also gave him watch parts, materials, movements. And so the challenge that he had with his brothers was to go through this material to see if they had a movement that would fit the size of this pocket watch. And by stroke of luck, they had one. So once he found that movement, he knew he was going to be able to achieve this. And that, so he felt like he succeeded. And that event gave him not only a place to work for that period of time, but also, and maybe equally importantly, it gave him the confidence to understand that he could approach these oppressors, these overseers, and that became kind of his model of how to survive in the camps. He would look for an opportunity. He would offer to fix a watch, and it would work out. One thing that it's important to mention is the German army was plundering watches all over. Yeah, they're plundering everything, but along with those things, there were watches. Many of them got sent back to Germany. Many were pilfered by the soldiers and the SS and the camp guards, and they would trade these in a black market economy within the camps. Now, I wouldn't say all, but the vast majority of the watchmakers in Poland were these Jewish men. And all of them were evacuated from the towns and the cities along with the rest of the Jewish population. So watchmaking was a skill that was really only available in the camps. And if a German guard had a pet watchmaker, so to speak, not only could he have his own watches fixed, but he could take watches from other people within the German army, the hierarchy of the camps, do favors for other people, and either get paid money or prestige for this. So there was kind of a little watchmaking / watch economy that existed in the slave labor camps. And my father and his brothers were just fortunate enough to have this skill that they were able to participate in that.
When Corvinus, the Nazi, taps his finger on the table and says, "But that watch must be fixed," do you think your father understood if he didn't fix it, his fate would be sealed?
Absolutely, without question.
So he knew it was fix that watch, or it's the gas chamber, or being shot, or something like that.
Yeah, he was playing a little confidence game where his life was what he was betting.
That was an incredible amount of nerve that he had to do what he did. That was really brave. Okay, now, another thing that happens in the camps, eventually your father moves and his brothers move to other camps. And I'm intrigued about the stories you tell about fixing watches in Auschwitz. And you read to us what happened when they landed on the platform at Auschwitz and they had to make their own tools. But people in this room, and I myself know a lot of watchmakers and know how they work and where they work. They work in very clean facilities with the latest tools, and it requires great concentration. But can you imagine working on a watch? You're sitting in dirt, you're in a pit in dirt. Standing over you are men with machine guns who could murder you in an instant and not suffer any consequences. And while you're in the pit fixing the watch, the men with guns are probably murdering other people, and you're hearing screams and things like that. That's a difficult position to be in, to fix a watch. And the amount of concentration it would have taken. It takes concentration to work on a watch in any case, but under those circumstances, it's extraordinary. And do you think that concentration, first of all, do you think that was learned from your grandfather? And secondly, do you think that gave your father and his brothers some sense of relief from the chaos and the horror that was going on around them?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the certainly the focus of being able to do that had to have been a learned skill. But one thing I would add to the way that you told that story is you're looking at it from the perspective of somebody having to keep the focus to fix a watch. From my father's perspective, that ditch where he was sitting in was the best place that he could possibly be, because the alternative was to be on top of the ditch getting beaten by this guy with a gun. And so this was a privilege for him to sit in this ditch and work on this watch. The fact that he was able to have the focus to do it, that is what you're talking about. And absolutely, it's he would have to block out the moral chaos and the physical chaos that was going on around him to be able to do that.
And all through this, your father maintains his optimism, and equally importantly, he maintains his relationship to his brothers and the fact that they have to stay together. And I know there's a wonderful story in the book about one of your uncles became rather sick, and he had a difficulty even sitting up at a workbench. But your father and your other uncle propped him up, because they knew that if the guards saw your uncle was sick, that was it, he would be killed. And they propped him up, and even though he was looking rather shaky, they said to the guards as they came in, "Don't disturb him. He's fixing a hairspring," or something like that, and he needs to concentrate. So they got over the fact that your uncle was sick and was very likely to be murdered if that was discovered. So where do you think, first of all, the optimism comes from? And where do you think that unity of the three of them comes from?
So the unity is probably the easier question, so I'll take that one first. Okay. My father said many times that he believed that it was the hardship that they had experienced as children. This feeling like they were really on their own without a mother, that they made it a very natural thing for them to take care of one another and take responsibility for one another. They made a pact between themselves that they would stay. When the three brothers left home, in that scene that I was talking about earlier, they very quickly made a pact between themselves that they would stay together no matter what happened and at any cost. And there were many times that they would take big risks to stay together. And many times it turned out that because they took that risk, not only were they able to stay together, but they were able to survive. The what was the other question? I'm sorry, I forgot.
Optimism.
Oh, the optimism. Yeah, the optimism, I just have no idea where that comes from. I grew up with this man, my father, and he was not a particularly optimistic guy, I have to tell you. But when he was in extreme circumstances, he understood that optimism was the only option, that it was life itself, that he saw before his very eyes people who fell into pessimism and depression, and they would die very quickly. He said that if somebody is hungry, and not just hungry, but really hungry, starving to death, and they think that they will have some food soon, another day, another 2 days, they can last longer. If somebody feels like, it's the food's never coming, they die much more quickly. So he said pessimism is a terrible disease. That's how he put it, a terrible disease. You have to be optimistic all the time. I think when you're not in such extreme circumstances, you can play the range more comfortably. But yeah, that was that got him through.
Now, we have a few people in the audience here today. So do we have any questions for Scott?
Yeah.
Yes.
I have a question. You said that when they arrived to the camp, their suitcase was taken away by the Nazis with all their tools. But then somehow they managed to go back to the suitcase and get that movement. How did they get the suitcase back?
Okay, I'm really glad you asked that question because it's an important clarification. So they took away, the Germans took away all of their tools when they arrived on the ramp in Auschwitz. But they were in 3 slave labor camps before Auschwitz, and they had the tools with them in those slave labor camps. So it was only in Auschwitz where they had to manufacture those couple of tools themselves with a nail and a earmuff spring.
Okay, so that was towards the end.
That was towards the end. That was already 1944,
Okay.
in the summer of 1944.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. Thank you for that. Gary?
So what happened to your mother?
My mother grew up in St. Louis. She was a local girl that my father met when he emigrated there in 1949.
And did you think that Corvinus knew that there was no movement inside this watch, and it was?
Yes, absolutely. He told my father when he fixed when he finally handed him the watch and it was running, he was very surprised. He thought that he was going to fail and this was going to be, the bullet in the head. But he said that he took that watch around to many places all over Europe, Paris, Berlin, places in Warsaw, and that everybody told him the watch couldn't be fixed. It's just an empty shell. So he actually told my father, "You're something I have to appreciate. Nobody else told me that they could fix this watch."
Do you think there were a lot of other watchmakers that had the same experience at the camps? Was this an exclusive story, or did it repeat itself?
So especially as I started to work on this book more seriously, I started to find other stories about other watchmakers in the camps, and watchmaking was definitely a thing in the camps, and many of the camps had formal watchmaking workshops. So, for example, in one of the slave labor camps, Starchowice, my father found some German guard to fix watches for, much as he did in the previous camp. But his brother got a job working in the watchmaking workshop, which made it possible for him to get sometimes parts or a tool if he needed it or something like that. But yes, there was as I had mentioned, most of the watchmakers in Poland were these Jewish men. And so they put them to use in the camps as much as they could.
And as unimportant as this may be, what were the types of watches of the era that they were working on? Mostly pocket, wrist, any brands that still survive today?
The only watch brand that's mentioned in my father's story is there was one Omega watch that he mentioned was one of the watches that he accumulated in Auschwitz. But beyond that, I have no idea.
Thank you, Gary. Yes, Carrie.
What message would you like people to take away from the book?
Well, if my father were here, he would tell you that at every stage in the war, he consciously trained his memory to remember every detail of what happened, because he wanted people to understand what happened in the German occupation of Poland and the concentration camps. So nothing like that would ever happen again, not to the Jews and not to anyone else. For my part, as his son, I would like the readers to take away, to identify with my father's resilience and his initiative. My father and his brothers were regular guys who made a commitment to each other and to their core values. And time again, they would do the simple hard thing when they were faced with the most extreme, difficult situations. And that opened up inside of them a level of tenacity and resilience that they could never have imagined. And I think my father and his brothers set a very powerful example that calls to the hidden capabilities and potential in all of us. Every morning they would wake up with a single-minded focus to stay together for that day and do whatever they needed to do to survive.
And do you think that the story of your father and his brothers will help in any way with the general Holocaust education movement that's going on?
I hope so.
Okay.
I don't know exactly how to answer that. I think everybody likes a good story, and I think that this is not a history book so much as it is a story about family and overcoming hardship and brotherhood, and there's all of these positive things that one can learn from the example of my father and his brothers. And if through accompanying my father on this journey, people learn the larger history of what happened in the Holocaust and World War II, that's great.
Have you ever had any desire to fix a watch or to learn anything about watchmaking?
I really do now.
Okay.
As a kid, I didn't. I have to tell you, watchmaking was like an ark, like Noah's Ark, for my father and his brothers that carried them through the deluge of the war and the moral chaos that they had to get through. And to take the analogy further, the ark, when the storm receded, the ark landed in the United States, which was this land of unlimited opportunity. And my father, in many ways, continued to live inside of that ark. Watchmaking was his livelihood. That was how he achieved his little piece of the American dream. But from the perspective of me and my brothers, we saw that ark as a bit limited and associated with the old world, and we wanted to branch out into the opportunity, the possibilities that we could find. Now, I mentioned before that even my grandfather didn't push his kids to learn watchmaking. And likewise, my father never pushed us to learn watchmaking. If I had shown an initiative, maybe he would have. I'm sure he would have. But I'm a little too late on the mark for that career.
So you became a lawyer.
So I became.
And one of the things that fascinates me about the story is the fact that, as you mentioned earlier, your daughter Orly threatened to write the book herself if you didn't do it. And I'm curious, do you think your father's spirit and the effect of the experiences of the camps, some way it's transferred through generations? There's some kind of way in which it moves through a family. And if you think your daughter's desire to have the book done was she wanted to tell the story of her grandfather.
So let me answer the question this way. My daughter Orly and all of my kids knew these stories very well long before they knew the story of the Holocaust. And so they relate to these stories of my father and their grandfather as family stories, family legacy. And as she learned the bigger picture, the history of the Holocaust was like a fill-in for this family story. So she got the inspiration from those stories, and so she really connected to it. Now, absolutely, I think any person who's a second-generation survivor will tell you that whatever this thing is that we call the Holocaust, because it's so big, it defies easy definition, especially as it's filtered through family experience. That trauma and the lessons from it in a positive way also do travel from generation to generation, and I feel it on a visceral level. It's something that's a vital part of my personality and something that I've had to learn to work with and do a little judo to make it work for me.
Well, it certainly is an amazing story. And personally, as I said, as someone who knows a lot of watchmakers, I think they would all be shocked that someone could fix a watch in a ditch in Auschwitz. And the foundation, Haute Horologie, which on its website has a segment about great watchmakers of the past. Your father should be in there.
Thank you.
That's my view. Everyone agree with that here?
100%.
Gary, do you have another question?
Just two last ones. Did your father continue making watches when he emigrated? Did he repair watches and set up a shop here in the States?
Yes, absolutely. He set up a shop in St. Louis, worked as a watchmaker for somebody else for a while, and then set up his own shop. He was the watchmaker. My mom was the salesperson, and that's how he got us through life and put his kids through college.
And finally, when will the book be available?
The book will be officially released at the end of June.
Yes, Jim.
I have the privilege of reading the book a bit early, have the privilege of being here, and just want to thank you, Scott, for sharing the story. I think we don't realize that with the passage of time, people forget, and I think it's really important that we don't. And this book, I think, will help many people remember, and I really want to thank you for sharing your story. Keep telling it. I hope when the book comes out, you'll come to the U.S. and share it in the U.S. as well.
Thank you so much.
Well, yes, if anyone wants to buy the book, it is available on Amazon for pre-order. And you can you order through your website, Scott?
Yes,
Okay, scottlenga.com.
scottlenga.com, yes.
Right. So if anyone's interested in knowing more about the story and in ordering the book, either Amazon or scottlenga.com. So I think that's about it.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Scott, for coming and talking to us about this.
And thank you so much for inviting me. I can't tell you how much I appreciate all of your help and support.
Oh, you're welcome. Okay, everyone. Thanks for coming and thanks for watching.